Going into April this year, I, like many others, was experiencing unprecedented levels of hype due to the Game of Thrones final season premiering as well as the release of Avengers Endgame. At the time, it seemed like either of these could be a genuine contender for the most impactful digital entertainment event of the decade, yet only one of them met these lofty expectations. There's a plethora of reasons for Game of Thrones flopping, and plenty of people have already done comprehensive breakdowns of why it was so disappointing. But if, like me, you're still not over how much of a shit show Game of Thrones really was, I think I've got a fun game for us to play today. By looking at how well both Game of Thrones and Avengers Endgame managed to achieve the same goal, in this case provide satisfying fan service, we can begin to get an idea as to why so many aspects of the last season of Game of Thrones felt so lazy.
I can do this all day.
Yeah, I know.
Fan service is a term that I've only been starting to hear over the last couple of years, so I did some research into its origin. Traditional definitions of fan service come from anime and manga, referring to the needless sexualization of characters in a way that doesn't contribute anything of value to the plot, something that Marvel has been guilty of in the past. Because of this history, fan service often has negative connotations. However, I'm not always going to be using the term that way. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be using a fairly broad and neutral definition of fan service. Pretty much any moment that was put in with the primary intent of getting a smile out of the fans counts. In the past, Game of Thrones rarely offered any fan service. In fact, some of the most memorable scenes were those which horrified fans, such as the Red Wedding and Ned Stark's execution. There was of course a copious amount of nudity and violence, but it never felt forced or patronising. For me, there's a very clear turning point where the showrunners started getting fan service very, very wrong. I think most of us were instantly repulsed by seeing Mr. Sheeran show up on our TV screens there, and it's not too hard to figure out why. It made no sense whatsoever as a cameo. Whilst there have been a few Game of Thrones cameos previously, they've all been discreet to the extent that I missed essentially all of them. Meanwhile, Eddie Boy and his goofy smile over there was in nearly every shot of the scene. Even worse, he was one of the biggest faces in pop culture, so to see him not so inconspicuously dropped into a fantasy world brings with it a whiplash effect, as you're snapped out of your immersion and back to real life. To top it off, the whole 4-minute scene itself is nearly completely redundant to the plot and world building of the show, with maybe the only thing of relevance that comes from it being a quick reminder that Lannister soldiers aren't necessarily bad people, despite their allegiance to the Lannisters, something which most fans were probably conscious of already. Contrast this abomination with Avengers Endgame, which was absolutely packed with cameos, all of which I'd considered to be done successfully. Firstly, co-director Joe Russo cameoed in this scene with Captain America. Not only does his dialogue contribute to the world building of post-snap MCU, but he also takes a far less intrusive amount of screen time than Ed Sheeran does in Game of Thrones. Another cameo to consider is that of Taika Waititi as Korg. Korg may not do too much to further the world or plot of the movie, but he does provide hilarious comic relief.
Thor, he's back. That kid on the TV just called me a dickhead again.
Whilst he does have a fair amount of screen time, the character is entirely CGI based, so there's no risk to breaking immersion by recognising Waititi's face, unlike Ed Sheeran. Finally, we can't talk about MCU cameos without talking about Stan Lee. Whilst there's perhaps a case to be made for his cameos to be immersion breaking, they're almost always under 10 seconds long, and there has been a precedent set for him to cameo all the way back to the original Iron Man. In fact, pretty much all the Endgame cameos had already appeared in a previous movie, to the extent that I'm not sure whether to call them cameos or returning minor characters. Of course, fan service comes in more forms than just cameos. Often, a character's arc will be developed or concluded in a way that should probably be considered fan service. And honestly, Game of Thrones gets off to a pretty good start at this in the first couple of episodes. We get a ton of long-awaited reuniting of characters. All of the living Stark children are in Winterfell for the first time since season 1. Jon rides Rhaegal. Brienne is knighted whilst Pod showcases another one of his hidden talents. And Jaime finally has the awkward catch-up with Bran.
No.
Where they get it wrong, however, is from the Battle of Winterfell onwards. Almost all of the aforementioned satisfying character developments are ruined by the later episodes. It would have been perfect for Brienne to have died in the Battle of Winterfell, sacrificing herself for one of the Stark girls in one last act of honour that's consistent to her character, giving everyone a final reminder why she's truly a knight. So perfect, in fact, that D&D felt the need to subvert our expectations, having her survive so they could have some ham-fisted resolution to the Brienne, Jaime, Tormund love triangle, then having her fade out of the show, only appearing occasionally to pine over Jaime. Another great example for this can be seen with the Stark children. It was fitting to have them all home to face the supposed biggest threat the show has to offer, considering Ned Stark's famous line, claiming, "The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives." However, the season concludes by contradicting this philosophy entirely, having them all go separate ways, with great distance between them. At least, I think King's Landing and Winterfell are far from each other. They might have magically moved closer together, considering characters were getting between them in a single jump cut by the end. I'm not going to go into detail on every blunder squeezed into the last few hours of Game of Thrones. If I did, we'd be here all day. But there are a couple more dumb character progressions that need a quick mention. Bronn makes no sense as Master of Coin. He quite literally doesn't understand what debt is. And Jaime had a complete 180 on a great redemption arc to go get crushed by some rocks, which is a deliberate metaphor for David Benioff and DB Weiss ruining their post-X-Men Origins redemption to get crushed by a pile of Disney dollars. Thankfully, there's more comparisons to be made with Avengers Endgame, who also integrated fan service into character arcs and managed to not have those moments contradicted or undone shortly after.
And I am Iron Man.
Possibly the greatest piece of fan service in the film, Tony Stark's last 4 words will now be firmly engraved into movie history. Not only does this prove as a stark reminder, of where Tony came from, but it also cleanly punctuates where his story ends. And that's half the reason it was so impactful. The fact that they provided his greatest moment at the very end of a 22 movie crescendo means nothing can come after the fact to undo it. Now compare Tony Stark finally being able to rest after years of anxiety to Brienne finally getting the title of Sir after years of vulnerability. Both were satisfying as they felt like a perfect conclusion. But Brienne's story didn't end there, as she essentially became a plot device to facilitate the butchering of another character's arc.
Stay with me. Please. Stay.
A final comparison can be made between Captain America, Bran Stark, and Arya Stark. When Steve Rogers turns the course of the fight with Thanos by wielding Mjolnir, it's just as much a piece of great fan service as it is a satisfying development in his character arc. On top of that, without this intervention, the story could have ended with Thanos winning there and then, so there's many layers to why this moment is so effective. Now, think about Bran's arc, which for most of the show's duration was being dragged north to become the Three-Eyed Raven. It would be completely insane to have no payoff on him finally acquiring the abilities of a warg, yet aside from this confusing scene in the battle for Winterfell, he doesn't use his powers once. Similar things can be said for Arya, who has a similar journey to become no one, and, whilst her stealthiness does come in handy, she doesn't use her face swapping ability once in the final season. Before I finish up this video, I want to take a quick look at one final subcategory of fan service, that of meta.
A song of ice and fire.
Meta is when a creative work references itself or the conventions of its genre, and there are a couple of examples from Avengers and Game of Thrones to be compared. The most impactful difference between each work's use of meta comes from the purpose of it. When Tyrion becomes a conduit for the showrunner's autofellatio by talking about the power of storytelling, a viewer can't help but feel slimy about the writers being so condescending, saying they wrote such an interesting story, and that's why Bran has to be king. All this power of stories stuff does set up some amazing irony later in the episode, as the in-universe version of A Song of Ice and Fire omits Tyrion's existence altogether, so it was presumably as poorly written as the last season. Now that's meta. Avengers Endgame also references its source material, but manages to do so in a way that doesn't seem excessively self-congratulatory.
Hail Hydra.
Captain America's Hail Hydra is a reference to a controversial comic where the character defects to Hydra, something that fans of the comics can appreciate without the moment being confusing for those out of the loop. When I first started thinking about making this video, I figured it'd be an easy way to take some cheap shots at the most vilified writers in television right now, whilst praising a movie I really enjoyed. But as I began to really think about the last season of Game of Thrones, I started to understand just how disappointed I really was. The first 6 seasons of the show constitute some of my favourite moments in television, but now I'm not sure if I'll ever watch them again without being bitter.
I will hurt you for this. A day will come when you think you're safe and happy, and your joy will turn to ashes in your mouth. And you will know the debt is paid.
Anyways, thanks for watching, let me know what you thought of the video down below, and if you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing for more in the future.
Best season ever!